Welcome to the India Energy Hour, where we explore the biggest questions shaping energy transitions, climate action, and sustainable development in India and beyond. Your hosts for this episode are Shreya Jai, energy writer and policy analyst, and Dr. Sandeep Pai, energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. If you enjoy listening to the India Energy Hour, please rate us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. As India races towards a cleaner energy future, the conversation often revolves around solar and wind. But are we overlooking a reliable, round-the-clock source of clean energy that lies beneath our feet? In this episode of the India Energy Hour, Karthik Ganesan, Fellow and Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, joins Dr. Sandeep Pai to discuss the untapped potential of geothermal energy in India. Drawing on CEEW's recent report, The Future of Geothermal in India, Powering Economic Growth and Prosperity with Abundant Domestic Energy, he explains why geothermal deserves a place in India's clean energy mix. The conversation explores India's geothermal potential, its role in providing reliable clean energy, the challenges to scaling the sector, and the policies needed to accelerate its growth.
All right, Karthik, thank you so much for doing this. Like I said before we were recording, that we've been eyeing you for a while, so this was a great
Thank you. That makes me
opportunity to.
feel rather good.
Yeah. So let's just get started, and tell us about how did you get in the energy and climate world? Like, what's your background? Like,
Yeah.
where did you study, and
Yeah.
yeah, how did you reach here?
So incident. I mean, but as with most people I think in policy research, at least in India, I also have an engineering degree. It's a civil engineering degree. So very much linked to, I guess, in some sense, how life is built around us, right? So I think the induction into the things that we use and infrastructure. In fact, those are a master's 5-year dual degree program that also had an infrastructure engineering component. So introduction to this notion of how the country builds things was very much there already. Uh, was very interested in public policy, even graduating out of my this civil engineering degree. But somehow at that point, the financial resources didn't come together. So I decided to just go work. I worked for 4 years in aviation, in consulting, and then at an airline. Seems very odd, but I was practicing operations research, so it felt like a good place to learn new techniques. Eventually, of course, it just became very sort of what do you call it, repetitive, and I didn't feel like I was adding much value. But incidentally, the genesis of my interest in, I guess, energy came because of what I saw at the time as a great sort of injustice to the Indian community or the South Asian community that's helped build the Middle East in some way. The last job that I had was actually in Abu Dhabi, and I've seen workers struggling in 43-degree heat, being denied what we today are discussing so vehemently in India with regard to heat stress in urban areas. I've seen soft racism of South Asians working in the Middle East, the very people who helped build it. And what I realized at the end of it was the reason why a lot of people are leaving India in droves is because India just is not able to offer the quality of life that they effectively end up experiencing in the Middle East. And at the core of it, again, I grew up in the Middle East actually as a kid until the age of 15. I came back to India just for these competitive exams. And I realized immediately, right, was the electricity and the energy that you actually use to run your daily life. That is a big part of what actually, helps you keep that standard of living. And I was kind of sold on the idea, as an engineer, you have an intuition of how the energy system functions. Almost there, right? Innately, it's built into you. I felt that was a good entry point. And like with many people, I also had this fantasy of, cracking the UPSC and making a change. I did that thankfully without, giving up my job, which I would say, but, if you have a plan B, your plan A ain't working. So basically didn't make it. I jokingly tell my friends that I don't have the Bihari entu that you need to actually get into the services. So I didn't make it, and I ended up going to a public policy degree school because you need to sort of have this advertisement that I'm willing to you know come into the space which I'm not trained in, and also learn a bit of econ, macroecon, public financing, banking, so that you've kind of got a sense of how the economy functions overall, right? It's not just a narrow engineering perspective, and learn about the political economy of things, which is of course front and center. As soon as I was graduating from this program at the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore, um, I had thankfully, a mentor by the name Surya Sethi, who was associated with the integrated energy policy way back in 2006. And, he told me about, I guess this think tank that CEEW was. It was literally a 5-person team then. I had interviewed with them and he said, this is a great place to be at. I think they're going to do things differently as compared to what currently exists in the Indian economy. There weren't too many organizations in the early 2010s that were doing public policy and energy, right? I mean, CSTEP was just about getting started. Terry was of course always there. So he convinced me to to say what, it's a risk worth taking, and I guess that's how I got into CW in 2012. I've been here for the last 14 years. I mean, in Delhi, unfortunately. I mean, I think the work's been great. That's what's kept me here. The city, not so much, but it's been very rewarding. And I think but the only thing I would say is this, that I don't think the opportunities today in this sector are the same as it was in 2012, which is always a first mover advantage or an early mover advantage, right? It's a lot more competitive. I can't imagine that a person, let's say, having spent like I did 15 years now in this space, 14 years, got as many emails from young people saying I want to apply to CEW. Back then there weren't that many, right? Even with those few, were hard enough to get back. But now you can imagine the number of people are looking to this. So I think the solution is that we need to build more organizations that work on this across the country. It can't be just a handful that's hogging all of the limelight and the focus and the resources that go with it. But that's the tough part, right? And I think the tough part is that scaling such organizations in India is a tough task because India inherently, I think, underinvests, like in all things R&D and long term. We underinvest in ideas and thought. Most of the support for all of this also is Western driven. It is changing. It is changing. We do see that there are many more domestic organizations that are interested, but still it's a realm that seemingly gets the eye of outside organizations. But the most important part is, can you maintain your independence irrespective of who funds you? And I think if you can do that, I think you can start off anywhere, and I think you can make impact. So hopefully that's what I'll have to say about my brief journey in the space and what I've managed to do. Yeah.
You said that you planned and you also prepared for UPSC. Now that you're on this side of policy preparation, policy advisory, if I can say so, has that quenched the need of not being a policymaker or a bureaucrat? What do you think? And connected to that, why do you think so many young people are now interested in this segment? Is it because it's really flying off the shelf, or do you think that there are now immense opportunities, or it is just because it is very, very close to the policy making circle, so it gets you kind of in that universe?
Yeah. I think the feelings about UPSC are mixed, in the sense that one, having had the opportunity and benefit of being able to speak to so many senior, early career bureaucrats, IAS, IFS, IRS, you name it, right? Obviously it's a fantastic opportunity that's been given to me to be able to speak to so many, and there are colleagues, spouses who are in the services today. So many candid conversations beyond just the professional sphere. You do realize that it's not a cakewalk, right? And I think, my wife would probably say, I told you so, right? You aren't cut out for this, which I think in retrospect, she's very right about, right? I think it requires you have to approach it differently. It's not it's a fine balancing exercise. And to me, that's also the slight tragedy of it, in terms of what do you end up balancing out at the end of the day. right? What are you balancing for? And clearly, the constraints that the bureaucrat faces are very different from an objective assessment of what, maybe you guys and I, who are all sort of, reporting and talking and analyzing issues about, think should be the balance. And yeah, I feel that life isn't that easy on that side. It may be rewarding in many ways, and I think we'll never know to what extent people have been influential in changing the course of whether it's the energy system or anything else that they work on. I'm sure there is something in it, right? Which is why so many people are going to it. But I can't imagine that I would have been able to stick around for the 25 years to see that impact happen. Maybe I would have tried hard to change things. Maybe I would have failed miserably. But I think the ability to be very objective and independent is something that I cherish. So, which may not have been the case, which may not, you may not have been able to express that, being in the bureaucracy. So, I think it's good that I didn't get in. Not that, but certainly, the if you ask me today, we still go back to these bureaucrats because we know that at the end of the day, a good bureaucrat with a sound head, with a good set of arguments can make change happen. So the possibilities still are with them, right? They are still our port of call. So it's not like we've lost our faith in what they can do. But it's just that, not everybody is able to sort of do justice to the ideas that you have because there are so many different constraints. So I think it's still worth going for, but it is but my main challenge with it, I think, is when there are colleagues who still quit and go and write the exam, right? And there are colleagues who've spent so many of their formative years after undergrad, 6, 7 years, 8 years, right? And then come in, as an RA stage, and sometimes you feel like, but they've learned something. They've learned something. So I think off the bat, if somebody asks, is it worth it? I mean, I would say it's a tough road ahead. Don't sort of maybe pursue it, but I think we need, just like with I think with politics, as we say, right, we need good people getting into it. If we don't, then what we get is what we see, right? So I guess the same way, I think good people need to try and get in to ensure that the change can happen. More power to those people who do it, but I don't think I had it in me for more than the 2 attempts that I made while taking on a job, right? I obviously didn't do it sitting out, etc., which I think may have made some difference. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend that, especially given the times that we're in. Yeah.
Great. I feel like we could just talk about this. This is
I
such an
know.
interesting topic about like how to influence and how to make a change from inside, outside, or in between, I guess, where, maybe CEW and others, I see it more in between, like you're inside in the sense that you're influencing, but you're not really. But but we want to discuss about the geothermal. So we'll move on to that topic. So, I've been intrigued about geothermal for a very, very long time. Living in US, this is a really growing topic. I've seen during the Biden years, there's been so many startups who are talking about it and all these different projects that have come up and so on. So I think, as far as I am, and maybe I'm wrong, this is one of the most uh, sort of like most elaborate report I've seen. There are some DST reports and other reports on geothermal in
Yeah.
the past. So your new report that you just released, The Future of Geothermal in India, Powering Economic Growth and Prosperity with Abandoned Domestic Energy, by the way. It's a very long title,
Yeah.
but I appreciate the sentiment.
The need for that. The
Tell us
need for such an elaborate title. Yeah.
so tell us about this report. First of all, by starting by saying like what was the motivation and what are some like big picture headline findings out
Yeah.
of this report?
Yeah. So, I would say the motivation for the report, to be honest, was an opportunity to work with this group called Project Inner Space, which you may have heard of, right? Which is the one that's the primary partner that's worked with us on this. In fact, it is largely an effort that Project Inner Space is led. CEEW just had the benefit of, being a partner here in India, and we readily sort of jumped onto, that request when they came and asked, "Do you want to work with us?" Because it was really an opportunity for us to learn. Because the last time I looked at geothermal was probably in class 9 or 10, right? When you hear about all the things that are geothermal, and you hear about conventional hydrothermal resources, and you wonder, oh wow, and then you think of natural springs. But then I did have a sense that geothermal is much beyond that, and it felt like being able to learn from this group was something that would be useful. And more importantly, they convened a set of actors from across the spectrum in India, both academia. They also asked other think tanks and other individual contributors to be part of it, and it felt like the right effort to be able to sort of go and contribute to. And more importantly, having worked in renewable energy for so many years, we understand that even in our pursuit of solar and wind, Sandeep, we're kind of naturally limiting ourselves to just two sources, right? If anybody asks you what is the renewable energy future, it's still just two things, not nearly as diverse as it ought to be, to give you the strength of conviction that, hey, this will serve me X years down the line. This will serve me when the weather is not great, when the wind's not blowing, or during the monsoons, when the sun's not around for many days, or during early winters in India, for instance, when there's no wind, there's no solar. So there is a need for diversity to cover for things that current set of renewable energy sources don't have access to. So attributes of, and that was the main driver, I would say, of wanting to pursue it. Now, in fact, Project Inner Space, the group, is also in some sense, funded by a bunch of organizations and entities that have their roots in the way the US is thinking about diversifying energy, right? If you look at the likes of Eric Schmidt, who, from Google, ex Google, his very contentious comment some time back was, build out AI, feed it with all the energy that it needs, and you watch it improve your ability to make decisions and optimize and make things better. So to the point where how you feed it doesn't matter, it'll eventually get you to a better state. Now, that's a thesis that may very well be appropriate for the US and other tech-led countries, but perhaps in the Indian context, maybe not so much. But that is a big part of the thesis, which is that you will ultimately discover how to feed this beast that's AI. And it looks like, whether we want it or not, AI is making a big foray into everybody's lives, even in India. Even though we're not players in the way that the models don't belong to us, neither do the data warehouses, and neither are the companies that are basically promoting it, right? So we're effectively sources of data, and we are sort of using some of these models. So if we are indeed sort of going down the road of being influenced, then, and if India has aspirations of being an AI powerhouse, then surely new sources of energy have to be explored. And that was really one of the reasons why I would say we really got in, to understand what beyond just the conventional hydro geothermal, of which the potential was insignificant in my view, right? If you look at even the national geothermal policy, that was actually, it was a coincidence that it got launched in the middle of the study that we were undertaking. Of course, it's been in the works. There was a previous geothermal policy as well. But even this one really did not update the potential too much. It was around the same 10.5 gigawatt figure, which would not have really gotten us to the levels of ambition that we have as a country in terms of overall growing it. And the focus again was limited to places that were geographically or geologically endowed with the surface manifestation of heat that is present beneath our feet. So again, it's only those pockets, but where unfortunately not too many people also live, right? Whereas where most people are in this country are in its urban areas, and it's an increasingly urban urban field that we see. And in that case, we'll have to rethink the way geothermal works, and we need to rethink the way we'll be tapping geothermal energy. And that's why I guess, my initial reading of it was that from the conversations, and we got into it. And I think we've come out, I would say this is literally the trailer, as they say, picture abhi baki. I feel really it's about how, after reading this, people will come back and say, this is rubbish. We don't have this kind of potential. Or they will say that we don't have these capabilities. Now let's figure out how do we build each of these capabilities. I feel right now the confrontation of the numbers that you saw, we can of course get into some of that in the next few questions. That is what I think I'm hoping to have, right, with people, and not limited to one or two places which are like the marquee spots, which are our Icelands. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, like, a couple 3 years ago, just working with Coal India, they were very interested to look at, some of their underground fires and whether you can convert them into sort of like in Jharia, Raniganj. So I think your kind of
Yeah.
report, because when we were doing a remote sensing analysis, it was not really showing because the methodology was, had limitations and stuff. So I think your kind of work will give
Yeah.
us also an impetus to do that kind of work. Anyway, maybe it'll be worth sort of explaining the headline, findings, and then maybe
Mm.
Shreya can get in.
Sure. Sure. So I think the headline findings are that the potential that we see in India for different uses of geothermal are, one or two orders of magnitude, which is basically, 10, 100, or even 1,000 times bigger than what we envision it to be, right? To the point where it sounds so incredulous. But I think, as they say, right, if you can't dream of things that, are hard enough to sort of, shake you up and say, hey, is this possible? Then you're not probably dreaming it. But notwithstanding, philosophical thoughts around how you should think of potential, we're looking at 11,000 gigawatts of heating, 11,000 gigawatt of thermal heating that's potentially possible out of geothermal for various different use cases, right? Which is basically direct heating, not through electricity. We're looking at 1,500 gigawatt worth of cooling potential that is possible from geothermal. We'll discuss how each of these things comes up as well. And we're looking at about a 450 gigawatt worth of electricity generation potential from the higher enthalpy regions. And there's a ton of jobs, of course, also that will go along with it. What we do find is that not just because the potential is higher, but because the electricity conversion and the generation possibilities are in fewer areas, and that resource quality is, what do you call it? The probability with which we understand that resource to be there is lower. And today, given where technology is, it's very likely that if I start with electricity generation as the leading entry point into geothermal, everybody will say, too expensive, let's not consider it. Right? It'll be like the way solar was in 2009, 2008, 17, 18 rupees a kilowatt hour or more. It was more. Gujarat signed, the very first PPA that everybody talks of, right? It was 17 rupees, right? It was even more, in fact. But that's it. It is not to say that we shouldn't ever start geothermal for electricity. In fact, the ONGC pilot that is happening in Ankleshwar or the one that is in Puga as well, both will probably have a component of electricity generation. But that's not probably what we want to start with. That's what one of the highlight findings is. Because in India, the need for heating and cooling for industrial processes and for cooling for, whether it's for residences, for commercial places, for, productive applications, whether it's, cold chains, right, whatever you might want to call it, all of that, it's electricity that we generate, and then we sort of, convert that to heating and cooling. Instead of going to electricity and then, having the losses that you have, but whatever source it might be, let's just directly cut to the chase and get to the heat and the cold, which we can get through different ways, right? Because ultimately it is already in the form of heat, not very great quality heat, but good enough. Can we basically augment it to provide it for these different end uses? And during the discussion at the launch as well, I think people were in agreement that that's perhaps where we should be headed. But even within this, whether the early options are in the low, sort of sub-kilometer geothermal, which is, through, heat pumps, if that's what, comes to mind, or whether it requires us to drill very deep and go into, deeper reserves, which are where the temperatures are higher, but where the drilling costs end up sort of then becoming more expensive. I think there was less consensus. It felt like in that conversation that we had, because we had experts, we had people who were part of the report, literally having a free-flowing conversation between the panel and the audience. It felt like at that moment, there was a lot of, focus on what is beneath the ground, not so deep, right? Starting anywhere between in the hundreds of meters from the tens to the hundreds of meters. But then a lot of people sort of started exhibiting skepticism on the ability of heat pumps because they were very expensive. They are still continue to be. In fact, you live in a cold place. You have a sense of where heat pumps actually work and don't work. And even in the Nordic countries, barring Sweden, the adoption of heat pumps is not that prevalent, because even for them, they're like, hey, you know what? It's not the go-to thing for me. So people felt like, you know what, if I'm actually able to sort of come together, as multiple entities that are consumers of heat, and if you are able to, prospect more intelligently. And what do I mean by that, right? Today, we find that our ability to discern where geothermal is limited by how well we've explored the subsurface, whether it's through seismic studies, whether it's through magnetotelluric surveys, or whether it's through, drilling that we've done. And a lot of this data is unfortunately locked up in the oil and gas industry, which has traditionally sort of kept it only available for those who want to further drill for and explore oil and gas. And because a lot of them are, early resources were spent by ONGC and OIL, the guardians are the Director General of Hydrocarbons, DGH, which is not the entity that is actually sort of overseeing the geothermal development. Right. So in some sense, there is a bit of a disconnect as to who owns the data, who will facilitate it for the people who will actually explore and prospect. So not assuming that we overcome this, and if you're able to actually sort of say that I identify a parcel or an area, broad area where potential is likely to be high, and if you have enough people willing to sort of say that if we do strike resources here, we will figure out how to basically tap it. We will all contribute to the the equity that's needed, raise the debt from the appropriate people, and then share the way the energy comes, right, through a network, through a grid. I'm talking obviously about an industrial style setup where you're actually able to have the appetite for the capital and also be able to take up the heat that will actually provide. It might be a good way to start. And so that's the way I think the discussion panned out. There are, of course, still, we've had conversations subsequently actually with entities that are in the AI space without naming them. And for them, it's the electron that still makes the difference, which means that, they still want it to be electricity. It doesn't matter what cost, because as we discussed, they want that diversity, and they want that diversity at any cost. So there are also parties that are potentially interested in what geothermal has to offer at a very high premium, because even 10 megawatts at a significant premium is diversity and more reliability that they're building into their supply. So they'll do it. Now, whether they'll do it for 100, for a gigawatt, is a different question. But for some of the early exploratory efforts, you may even get entities interested at that high price, notwithstanding, because it offers them, the diversity that we spoke about earlier.
Thank you for explaining this so comprehensively. At least now I understand, because it is like an initiation into this new energy source that is coming in. And you're absolutely right. After studying it in a school, it is now that I have such a proper understanding. Thank you. And I went through the report, very interesting findings. But for our listeners, I wanted you to just walk us through the methodology that you deployed for report, for data collection and everything. Can you explain that a bit?
Yeah. So, in fact, this is the portion actually that, as I said, was done by partners at Project Inner Space. So, I'm obviously sort of parroting something that I myself have, to be honest, picked up in my conversations with them and my own reading of the chapters as they were being written. So, let's just break this down, right? So, ultimately, what is it that you need to be able to go after geothermal? You need to understand what is the thermal gradient, which is basically the rate at which temperature is increasing after a certain depth, right? Of course, it actually decreases for a certain depth, primarily because the ground is much hotter in tropical countries because of the sun's radiation. So whereas immediately below the surface, it's actually at a slightly cooler and a more steady, 25, 22, anywhere between 22 and 28 degrees. But then as you go deeper and deeper, it starts getting hotter and hotter. Now, you have to basically be able to assess how hot does it get at what depth, and how much is the drop in temp, or rather how much is the increase in temperature for every 100 meters that you drill. So for some people, that a good gradient could be 4 to 5 degrees for every 100 meters, which means that in a kilometer you're already 40 degrees hotter, right? In 2 kilometers, 80 degrees. Of course, it doesn't scale linearly. It could very well be, plateauing. But what's the big challenge? The big challenge is knowing what this temperature is at that depth. And more importantly, knowing whether there is a reservoir, which is basically a source of, liquid, which is water typically, right? With which you can actually bring that heat up, because ultimately you need a medium to bring that heat from that depth to the surface. Sometimes you could, of course, provide that from the top, but the expectation is if there is actually water that is there that I can effectively use, because sometimes geothermal may also be in water stressed areas. You may not have a ready source of water that you can actually sort of put in there. The third is how porous are the rock formations, what is the geology of basically that area, so that you can actually figure out whether, the liquid or the water that the medium that you're basically putting in there, right, is actually able to move through, collect the heat, and then come back up through this, the outlet well that you've basically got, right? So all of these different parameters, Shreya, are things that you effectively need to, well, prospect actively through either, as I said, surveys, through drilling, or through, seismic assessments. Now, the reality is some of this stuff is actually not available to the average researcher in the country. Specific, researchers who've actually sort of worked on these in small pockets, or who've had access to, consulting project within, with one of the oil companies, they tend to have some of this data in parcels and in pockets. And what we've effectively done in this study with the help of our project in the space colleagues is piece together. And I think there was a faculty at, if I remember correctly, he's at IIT BHU, Professor Maurya. He, along with the project in the space team, basically came up with the methodology to effectively impute what is the temperature at various different depths. What does it then compare? How does it then overlay with the porosity of the rocks? How does it overlay with the availability of an aquifer? And then coming to a sort of like a composite index that then puts together the suitability of resource in different parts of the country for different use cases, depending, as I said, whether you have an aquifer, which will effectively allow you to cool, whether you actually have the porosity to be able to sort of circulate water through that, whether you can actually fracture rock in certain places to be able to then, induce a geothermal reservoir, an artificial reservoir through which you can actually then pump water back. All of these put together, and then that is what effectively came out as this. I'll share with you a link to a map that's actually available. It's, in fact, I don't know whether you've already seen it. I think it may have been labeled on the website, GeoMaps tool, which is an international resource actually, and there is an India focus. And if I remember correctly, there is I think there's a special sort of zoom in that they've done on the Cambay Basin, because there was some additional data made available through one of these, one of our benefactors who has a better understanding, which is one of the reasons why it's also very exciting, because, the Cambay Basin also hosts a lot of industry and also hosts a lot of oil and gas exploration that's happened. So, which means it's a great place for us to start. So, I know I haven't fully answered. It's obviously the methodologies. I'm not going to give you, in fact, the specifics of that I think are in, I'll have to look at the specific chapter, but I think the specific equations, if that's what people are interested in, is there. But suffice to say that it is effectively trying to understand the temperature, the porosity, and the nature of, the rock that is actually here at different levels. And they've done their best, as I said, with the existing data. Now, what this doesn't do, what this exercise hasn't done, is evaluated what is going to be the cost of drilling, and as a result, what is the economic potential. So, like with any resource, right, whether it is you start from what is a technical feasible resource, right? And then you probably move on to, what is economically extractable, depending on what cost thresholds you have. Then you overlay, constraints with regard to whether that land can be explored, whether there's, a defense related barrier, whether it's, socio-economical, or whether it's, with regard to a natural ecosystem that you want to preserve, that you don't want to sort of, alter, and, other resource availabilities. And then you come out to what is, the actually viable potential. So what we have indicated at the high level, this 11,000 and the 1,500 and the 450 is literally that unabated, assuming you can go everywhere at any price, this is what you will get. Now, what is needed is for us to be able to actually validate some of that with the actual cost of drilling, to then overlay, other environmental parameters, to then say this is what is possible here, this is not what is not possible here. Whether, for instance, there are risks associated with seismicity, depending on where you're drilling, and all of these other constraints, and then you might come up with something. And that number could actually will obviously be smaller. Now, whether that is so small that it becomes insignificant is a question, but it's very unlikely. We're looking at 3 orders of magnitude. So even if it comes down by 2 orders, I'm still at 100 gigawatt, which is still a phenomenal amount of resource, for instance, for heat, right? So that's the long and short of Shreya of how I think we've assessed it. So still a lot of work to be done, and we're in talks with various entities and partners. And what we realize is there are others who are obviously working on it, right? The DSTs are there. There's actually a geothermal advisory group that's actually set up by MNRE, which is held by a lot of experts in the oil and gas space. It's just that we don't have a way to actually come together, a task force actually, that's the word. We don't have a way to come together to contribute to increasing the knowledge that's out there. I think, the knowledge is sitting in there in different parcels, and there are people who I feel, even among the experts, there's not consensus on what is possible and not possible. Each has their own, preconceived notions around what is and not. And I think we need a better mechanism to collaborate to say this is what we can truly do. And right now, that doesn't exist. MNRE is still trying to figure out how it makes them happen. Our report, I think, is one in a series of different studies that have come out. In fact, I think even NIAS came out, did a study actually in late April. Not a study, I think they did a session. The National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, who are located in the premises of IISc. So I'd love to also see what is it that they had to say. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. Long, but maybe not enough detail. Yeah.
No, great. I mean, and also, like you said, like I've always followed CEEW's modeling work on net zero, and one of the numbers that it always like shocks me, but also not shocks me.
5,000 gigawatt of solar that's required to power India.
Exactly.
Yeah.
5,000 and then 3,000 of wind and so on and so forth.
Correct.
I mean, it's a very powerful. Obviously, you can achieve net zero.
I mean, I just hope that we aren't made to eat our own words because there's a new tech that develops 10 years from now, right? But nevertheless, it is state of the knowledge right now. Correct.
Yeah, as of now. So in that context, even a 500 or 300, whatever geothermal ultimate economic potential, that's still very significant of firm power.
And it is exactly firm. Exactly. That's the word, firm, right? It's there all the time. Yeah.
Exactly. One of the other things is, and I think you probably alluded to, but I want to just go a little bit deeper. First is, in many countries, I think it's an exploration also of looking at the brine of geothermal and seeing if there is any critical minerals around all that. So that's one question. If you looked at that, if you will look at that. The second question is, what would need to happen from here to, let's say, let's imagine 2026 is the year what solar was in 2009 for geothermal. Exactly. What needs to happen in the next 10 years to even reach that 300, 400, whatever the actual potential is? So I have two questions. One is about
the first question. In fact, interesting that you should ask it. In fact, obviously, we are all researchers who are finding out more about geothermal as we research and read more. At that session, actually, the former additional secretary from of MOPNG was there. I think he is now part of a company that's actually, in the oil and gas space, drilling and prospecting. And one of the things that he said was that the new licenses to explore actually sort of gives the ability to explore a bunch of things, not just for oil and gas. You can actually potentially even explore for geothermal heat, for minerals as well. Of course, it's just that you need to basically get clearances from the respective ministries when it comes to what you actually do and how that resource effectively gets tapped after that. In the context of India, I mean, I think Sandeep, what I think we need to do better is bring together. In fact, you talked of minerals. So GSI, the Geological Survey of India, has actually done a lot of the drilling in many of these hotspots for geothermal. Right, even before MOPNG and others went, because MOPNG is focused, of course, on the places where oil and gas is, right? So that data exists with them. MOPNG hosts a lot of data that actually exists with the oil and gas drilling efforts. GSI also is host to a lot of the mineral exploration related stuff, right? Along with IBM and others. So we need a way in which all of this information that's sitting in different silos within these organizations comes together to be able to create layers of what all are the, for want of a better word, co-benefits of being able to look at this particular pocket for geothermal, because what all am I likely to find given the history of exploration that's actually happened here, the history of, even if it's not physical reconnaissance, even if it's seismic, if it's aerial surveys, right? What is it that I can actually anticipate here? And the moment we have that, I think we'll be in a better place to say we might strike, the proverbial gold, right, in this particular area. Let's go ahead and do it. Right now, that conversation is not there. In fact, having spoken to some of the line ministries, after a long, an hour-long conversation, it ends with maybe you should go speak to MNRE, right? I mean, which is, we started from there and we've come to you primarily because, there is a role for you. It can't be that, I go back to them because they aren't, the authorities ultimately who are, going to, who have a full understanding of this, who will make this available. So there is a need. I mean, and the good part is I think it's a small enough community. It's a small enough community of people who are interested, but it is still up to Government of India to, set the rules of the game and say what can you and cannot do, and what is it that the new licensing regime, how does it actually then reward somebody who actually finds it? Does it make it onerous for them to actually be able to tap the heat? In fact, there's actually a chapter on who owns the heat, and I would say for the most part, it's not fully clear. It's not fully clear because effectively, the government, it is still a public resource. Much like, oil and gas is a public resource that will effectively be, nationalized if it's found. Heat also technically is. There's no clarity there. So how do you ensure that you're actually able to give private sector the appropriate rights to be able to tap into it if it does discover, heat at a, in these various different explorations that they do, and how do you use that to monetize it? So effectively, if you don't have to pay a royalty and all of those like you have to, how does it then change the economics for you to actually go prospecting and be able to sell that to a potential customer? That effectively is what we need to see, because in India, ultimately, one of the reasons why oil and gas is not very remunerative is because of so many different charges you have to pay, right? There's right from the exploration license to the royalty that you have to pay, and ultimately what you make of every barrel that you drill in India, very different from what you actually get elsewhere. So that we need to, I think, establish in the Indian context. What was the second question again? We spoke about critical minerals and brine. I think we are very far away from getting to that point. Maybe when we overlay this, we might actually get a better sense of what's actually available there. But that said, this talking of brine, one of the things we need to obviously set up is how do you actually manage the environmental fallouts of geothermal? Because ultimately, it is about, for instance, if you would actually use the fracking route to do EGS, enhanced geothermal, you are going to inject, a fluid down there. There is some seismicity that does get induced. How do you manage that? And more importantly, if there are, different chemical constituents that are there at that depth, how do you ensure that you're actually managing them when they manifest on the surface? Right? Are you actually going to be able to concentrate them and ensure that you're not polluting surface water bodies and surface land? All of these need to be thought of before we sort of, put down this. Unlike the US, where, a lot of this is happening in, remote pockets where you can probably manage it. In India, if we are indeed going to tap into the 11,000 gigawatt, trust me, a lot of it is going to be very close to human settlements, which means that we will have to have our laws in place in terms of fallouts, rules of the game. How do you operate from day one? so that we don't end up experiencing sentiments that preclude the possible exploration of it in a large scale because the early experience ended up being bad. Right. Sorry. So going back to your second question was on, if I remember correctly,
No,
growth.
it was the same. I think you explained one was about, let's call it co-benefits. One of
Yeah.
the examples would be Brian. The second was what needs to happen,
Yeah. What needs
for
to,
this
yeah, on what
ecosystem.
needs to happen, exactly. On what needs to happen, I think is, I would say three things, right? One is identifying effectively, who owns the heat beneath the feet. I think that there needs to be more clarity with regard to how is it that this resource will actually be sort of uh, uh, tapped, because it'll then contribute to how it's costed and how it's actually provided to the different end users. The second is to be able to create this, inter-ministerial coordination among different ministries that currently hold the data, the ability to license, permit environmental or exploration, so that they can all then play a part in making things easier and at the same time ensuring that the right regulations are actually imposed to ensure the safety of the personnel and the environment that is going to be put in there. And I think the third is really ensuring that we are using the buzzword of the day, which is AI, to be able to actually consume a lot of this data that's sitting in there. And the good part, what we heard from DGH from our meeting is, I think in 2 months' time, the National Data Repository, which is basically where a lot of the DGH data sits, is actually going to be made public and on a cloud. So now, can we actually demonstrate that by using tools that are available to the lay person today, let alone the scientists who are actually working on this, can we actually create useful insights for furthering more deliberate exploration of geothermal in areas where the potential is actually there, by looking at well logs that have been dug by ONGC and the OILs and Reliances and others, to say this is where we can probably go and prospect, and lead a consortium of funders, whether that's private, whether that's public capital, to be able to then tap into this in a way that de-risks the capital for everybody who's actually investing in it. I think once we get this model right for the early ones, I think the private sector can come in and say, well, this is this is something that was followed. This is what we can actually do. Other than that, I think the high level one, I think one that we recommended is, I mean, along the lines of, I think, recognizing geothermal as a renewable energy resource and setting us a target. I think, like with everything, in India, having a target that you want to reach and then sort of, chasing up and looking at where the progress metrics are and what the barriers are has helped in the case of, solar and other renewable energy technologies. Something like that is clearly needed. And that number cannot be, the figure that we have currently as in terms of potential. I think it has to be significantly ambitious for us to be able to say then that this is how we scale the technology.
Karthik, some of the issues that you have mentioned reminds me of what coal gasification was facing 15 years back. There was no clarity on which the line ministry would be. There was no clarity on who will auction, who will sell, what would be the revenue sharing, etc. And I think these obviously these issues come to fore whenever there is energy source involved, especially something that is connected to a natural resource. But so for a private investment to come in, there has to be a policy framework. For a policy framework to be there, there has to be line ministry or ministries. So I just wanted to get an understanding from you, because you've now studied this so deeply. What would be the ideal policy framework? What are the current stakeholders in the public sector, like oil companies or ministries, which you think should take a lead? You mentioned that should be, identified as a renewable energy and should have a target corresponding to what other RE sources have. But if you can build an ideal supply chain policy scenario for me, what would it be?
I mean, I think that requires a little bit of, thought as to what is. So, first thing is this. I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that unlike solar or wind, which are also, of course, engineering. I mean, wind is a lot more engineering heavy than solar is. This is at the end of the day a very engineering heavy technology, right? Which is not something which is off the shelf. So in some sense, it goes back to, I guess, some strengths that we have as a country. We have the NTPCs, we have the ONGCs and the OILs. which have in the past and continue to deploy and demonstrate. But at the same time, what we don't, I think, tend to do well in some of these very heavily engineering solutions. I mean, for instance, the example of what happened even at Puga. I mean, in fact, the news today is that we finally actually managed to drill to 1,000 meters. At the altitude of 4,500 meters, which is where Puga sits, right? Puga in the Ladakh region. But we got into that project, not fully aware of the challenges that drilling at that height would present. And I think even when they reached 100 meter depth, they ended up having a blowout because the effectively the steam pressure that was seen there was actually so high that their casing and others was not able to hold it down. So I think the first recommendation, in terms of how you go about doing this, I think we need to basically demonstrate, as as government and as I think the different entities that are actually involved in, talking about geothermal, to present data that is more reliable. I mean, and if you think about it, if you think about the open acreage licensing policy, the OALP and others, one of the things that actually made available is some of these 2D, 3D data sets that these companies actually get from Government of India to say this is where you can potentially sort of go ahead and prospect, and that's on the basis of which they bid. So one is we need to be very clear that this data has to be made available first in a way that it ultimately then makes everybody, take logical and rational decisions in where they actually go and prospect. And in the absence of that, making this sort of like the wild west gold rush that that we witnessed in the US, back in the 1800s, is not going to help, because this is not one of those technologies where you can actually last for that long if you took that approach, because drilling is very, very expensive. At the same time, what we did here was that India actually has a significant competitive advantage when it comes to drilling. On the stage that day, in a conversation between ONGC and another entity that was involved in the drilling space, one of the gentlemen actually mentioned that a drilling rig, which typically, sort of retails at $8,000 per day, which is the rental fee, right? In India, goes for about $20,000 outside. So immediately we have a 50% cost advantage here in India when it comes to this. So how do we ensure that this lower cost, right, that we have in India on account of having this capability within, translates to better outcomes when it comes to the team, to in terms of the cost and the number of successful drills that we do. And for this, I think we'll need a couple of things. One is we'll need a much more mature industry, because we clearly don't drill as much as the West does. Right? I mean, I don't actually have that figure handy, but Sandeep, I don't know whether you might actually know this off the top of your head, right? How many, what do you call it, fracking wells end up getting drilled, in the Permian Basin in the US, or, at the peak, how many were they doing? Probably what we do in a year, they might be doing it, in a day or two, right? That's the frequency with which they were doing it. So we definitely need to up our game, and there needs to be budgetary allocation for some of this in the early stage. I mean, this unfortunately is going to fall on deaf ears, because it's a risky bet, and like with everything, we'll have the reasons why, being a developing country, we can't put in the kind of capital. So I think from the perspective of government and perhaps the stakeholders who will benefit from it, we need to come out with a clear value proposition for where is geothermal likely to bring down overall cost of the energy system. Today, that answer is not there, because we just don't understand, right, at what cost is industry today being supplied. When I say cost, I'm not talking about just the financial outlay, but also when it comes to the energy security implications of India relying on various countries for coal imports. Forget metallurgical, I'm talking even thermal, right? So at what cost is that coming? Gas, on which we are more than 60% dependent on imports today. How do we basically ensure that all of that is sort of costed in, whether it's through a multi-dimensional index, or whether it is through some scenarios where we actually sort of talk of outlays for forex and all of it, and how does it then compare to a domestically led energy source? So unless we're actually able to do that, I mean, that comes with I think what used to be earlier the paradigm, which is of integrated resource planning, where you actually factor in this. I mean, it's a dead word, right? I mean, how many people talk of IRPs today? I think in some modeling circles you may still hear the word of IRP, but it's not anymore a thing. We tend to go after tech that's sort of mainstream without really fully understanding where exactly is it that some of these niche technologies have a role to play. And that's the same reason why nuclear also doesn't have the kind of future, because we aren't able to think of signing up for a technology for the next 60 years at a certain price. We're like, what if something becomes cheaper tomorrow? What it requires you to do is to actually be able to have the conviction that signing on to it at a certain price with a certainty, locking it in, is actually beneficial. We can't be looking for that, oh, when it slides down, because unfortunately, if you go back to the early 2010s and the discussions that were happening in high powered committees in government of India, they were like, India should be a late adopter of solar, because when prices drop, we will benefit from it then. In some way, we ended up doing it, and I would say maybe we did, but the late adoption came at a cost, which is we didn't invest in the R&D to actually sort of do some of this stuff that we're not able to do today, right? To be actually able to manufacture from ingot to say, ingot to wafer to cell to module, we're still struggling. And that happens. So, and I would say then, how do we actually invest in the R&D to be able to create the talent pool that can actually open this sector up for you? And there are programs. In fact, I was pleasantly surprised with the number of people who graduated from IIT ISM Dhanbad, right? Who were actually part of the the fracking that is happening, has happened at companies like KN. So clearly the expertise exists, but do we have them in enough numbers to be able to do it for us at the scale at which we need? Clearly not. So I would say, instead of looking at the policy support that might be needed, to scale it, can we effectively sort of invest in the early R&D that's required to be able to, one, have professionals who are in allied areas to come into this, to dedicatedly focus on how do I then actually interpret the data that pertains to geothermal, to be then able to give intelligence to those who have the resources to say, what, let's go in here and prospect, knowing full well what we can actually anticipate at the bottom. If we can do that, I'd say we would have done well, and I think it'll take probably some tens of such efforts before we start getting confidence that this will actually lead to a solution which can actually supply the hundreds of gigawatt that it potentially has as a resource beneath our feet, right?
No, you very well said, and this is not just for geothermal. India loves to invest in tech, TRL 9. It should be ready and commercial and cheap, but not ready to invest in TRL 4, 5, 6, where it has potential and so on. We're really on time. I wish we had more time, but I want to end with one very brief question. What's next on this for you or CEW and the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I would say this. I mean, it's been 2 weeks, and in fact, even in the 2 weeks, we realized that there have been developments both globally as well as in India. Right, even during the conversation, that in fact on the day of the launch, the Fervo IPO had just gone out, and I think it got listed at a valuation of a whopping $10 billion. In the bigger scheme of the trillions of dollars that the SpaceXs and others are commanding, what's 10 billion, right? But notwithstanding, the small scale that it might be at, 10 billion still is a huge amount for a company that's pure geothermal, right? So, and then we of course had this this Puga Valley 1,000-meter drill that happened. So what I do see is that there is a momentum that's been created globally on account of this pursuit of 24/7 carbon free energy, as the Googles and the others in the world that have signed up to it are calling for, because they want potentially hourly matching to meet with their internal criteria of how they will fuel their data centers and AI setups. So this is going to scale in other parts of the world. In the US, for sure. There are, of course, plans underway in other parts of the world as well to do this. What for India? I mean, in terms of, I think what in India, I think we'll do well to actually demonstrate in a reasonably large size pilot. I mean, as far as CW is concerned, because obviously, raising money for a pilot with good amount of information is something that I think anybody should be able to do. And I think working with the stakeholders that are in the sector, and especially, as I said, in the next 2 months, given that the national data repository for oil and gas is going to be public, what we intend to do is use that to be able to narrow down on a few geographies within the country where we think that a combination of better modeling, right, along with this data can actually unlock new insights into, is it possible and are there the right surface conditions in terms of the demand, and is there a group of people that we can actually come together. And I think making that into a reality is probably our next step, right? Because I don't think this opportunity to actually shape a sector from the very start has actually been there for anyone in a while. Right? I mean, while nuclear is, of course, in some sense a new kid, I mean, it's very much something that government of India has led. Solar, China has pretty much led the way, the rest of the world is thinking. Whereas geothermal is entirely a convincing exercise in sort of getting domestic stakeholders to get excited about it, trying to see whether, very expensive financing, if presented with the right opportunity, can actually sort of come in and give it to us at a lower cost, because the source of energy itself is free and unending. So I would say quite excited by the prospect of working on this kind of an opportunity, which probably very few people have had. But the good part is what we'll be working with is going to be entirely public. And an entity like Project Inner Space, I would have loved to actually have one of them alongside for maybe a conversation, right, along with you guys. But they are a not-for-profit as well, so chances are that anything that they end up doing will also be entirely in the public domain. So the good part is, I think none of these resources and activities will be in a private domain, which will be closed off. So I think anybody who's interested, who's hearing this, who feels like they believe in geothermal, can actually approach either Project InnerSpace or CEEW and be part of it. And the final thing I would say is, we did find during the conversation, there are a lot of people who've actually sort of gone on these study programs to Iceland. In fact, Iceland being one of the stalwarts in geothermal energy, has trained a lot of people, and we find that many of them are actually, at a different point in that, curve of geothermal. Some of them actually have companies, Geotropy, for instance, right, of which Vijay Chauhan, in fact, brilliant guy, and seems to sort of have his head screwed on right in terms of how to tap geothermal, are doing things in Himachal where they're using high quality resource to be able to drive energy, geothermal use, energy use. So we've identified a bunch of people as well. So hopefully we'll be able to work with them in ensuring that we bring together stakeholders who know the sector and its challenges well, to be able to maybe have a pilot in, I'm hoping 3 to 5 years time, we actually have a sizable pilot for an industrial application somewhere in the peninsular India, which is not just remote, for a community. Because I think some of those will automatically start happening, because the army and communities that live close to those resources are already looking at this, given this push towards alternate energy forms. But mainstream industrial energy, can we look at something in the Gujarat area or in the East Godavari area, where we can actually look at powering up an industrial house or a few industrial entities? That's probably going to be the target for us in the next 3 to 5 years, Sandeep and Shreya.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This is great. Thank you, Karthik.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That was
Awesome.
really great.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow @DIEH Podcast and get in touch with the two hosts, @Shreya and @Sandeep Pai. Thank you for tuning in. Join us again for our next episode.